let me start again from the beginning about why the Constitution Committee decided that this was an appropriate time to undertake such a report. And if I may just draw attention to the fact that this seminar is called, as our report was, the process of constitutional change. We had to challenge you as organisers, I believe, in the first instance, because as in so many instances when this is discussed, this subject is discussed, people refer to constitutional reform, which the Constitution Committee decided was begging the question in the first place. And we very much wanted to emphasise the appropriate use of the word constitutional change. So I'm delighted that that is what this seminar is now called. We were stimulated really by the fact that we had been asked as a scrutiny committee to look at a great number of bills. You referred to a couple of the most prominent ones, the AV referendum bill, the this term Parliament bill, as well as the constituency changes in the previous 18 months of our work. We felt that it wasn't simply that we had been asked to look at these bills, but that in the dying days of the previous government, the Labour government, there had also been the rather infamous now entitled Cragg Bill, which the Constitution Committee, of which I was then a member but not the chair, had described as a completely unsatisfactory way to make constitutional change. So I have to say immediately that the provenance of this committee's decision to report again on constitutional change had nothing specific to do with the Coalition's programme, although obviously the Coalition's programme had been our initial area of work for the previous 18 months. As you said, Nat, the essential view that we took, and we heard evidence from several people around the table today who I'm delighted to see being here, and I'm sure will express their own evidence very clearly in the course of the seminar, was that what the government process in this country needed was a much more formal understanding and process of constitutional change without going anywhere near the concerns of some people who gave us evidence that we should be looking instead and trying to prepare some form of written constitution. We wanted to establish the fact that any government, the government of the day, should be subject to the Constitution, even if unwritten, not the other way round. And as you said, it has become rather the case over the last decade and a half perhaps, but it goes back much further than that, that constitutional change is something which can be the flavour of the political month, as we described the bill to create fixed-term parliaments, and not necessarily something grounded in very considered constitutional policy. You rightly said that we did struggle with the idea of being able to define distinctive constitutional bills in a way which wouldn't be too widely challenged. And again, you referred to Professor Sir John Baker's evidence to us, and I can only quote from that as I did in Hansard. He said, and we agreed with it, and I think he produced a list of 8 proposals, but amongst them were any alteration to the structure of composition of Parliament, any alteration to the powers of Parliament, or any transfer of power, as by devolution or international treaty, any alteration to the succession to the Crown or the functions of the monarch, any substantial alteration to the balance of power between Parliament and government, any substantial alteration to the balance of power between central government and local authorities, any substantial alteration to the liberties of subject, including the right to habeas corpus and the trial by jury. Now clearly that's a huge universe of interest, but it seemed to us that those were unchallengeable headlines of areas which could rightly be described and identified as being particular areas of constitutional change, which could then be legitimately put to a particular process. What we were not seduced by, and I think there are some people around the table who I remember discussing this with before who will probably argue differently this morning, we were not attracted by the idea that having identified these broad areas of constitutional change, that these should somehow be outsourced to some body of experts or some overseeing national commission which looked exclusively at constitutional change and then came back to Parliament. We thought that there were ways of simply identifying proper processes of government within the parliamentary system and within the system of executive government and parliamentary responsibility, which, if they were appropriately and properly followed, would be able to make a significant difference in the way constitutional change was processed. If you look, for example, at our recommendations on pre-legislative scrutiny, none of these were involved, for example, in the two bills you mentioned, the referendum on alternative voting, or indeed the fixed-term Parliament bill. Now, the Deputy Prime Minister, Mr Clegg, who, as you all know, is mainly responsible for constitutional change in this government, has said to our committee on at least 2 occasions that the reason for that was political priority, that it was necessary to make changes immediately, which could not therefore be subject to pre-legislative scrutiny and couldn't have been identified because of the nature of the formation of the coalition before the general election of 2010. We were prepared to accept that argument in some areas, but certainly not, for example, in relation to fixed-term parliaments, which we thought was simply a political. We were very clear about this was a political decision which had been appropriate in order to sustain the coalition over a longer period of time as they saw it over 5 years. Looking back into more recent history, we thought, and again there was absolutely no partisan identification with that, that if one, for example, looked at the process of devolution in the early period of the Labour government in the late 1990s, there was a sense in which the formal processes that we would have hoped to see more generally used had been developed, and I'm delighted that Bob McClellan is here this morning because he was very heavily involved in that process and he may want to develop that. But we saw that in terms of the public engagement which took place, the pre-legislative scrutiny, the publication of white and green papers, and very importantly the operation of the cabinet committee system in that process as something which, in a way, could loosely be described as a template for the way in which constitutional change could properly be agreed in a more formal way within the existing parliamentary processes. You mentioned the recommendation that we made about a ministerial statement attached to any bill of constitutional change, which I suppose, although it isn't equivalent, might be compared with the statement, which now, a formal statement, which is now attached to bills on the human rights responsibilities of the minister. Now, this is, as you said, a fairly modest proposal, but it would mean that the minister themselves would have to take the kind of responsibility that they take for making that ministerial statement on human rights, and they would particularly have to look at the way in which the bill affected other areas of government. Because one of the points that we were particularly concerned about was that individual changes on the constitutional process were being made without very broad reference to their impact across government. So that was an important step we felt would drag ministerial personal responsibility into the process at an earlier stage than it might be. One of the areas which we felt strongly about but came to no very clear or precise conclusions on, largely because we couldn't identify a particular solution which we were attracted by, was the whole area of the issue of public engagement in an early stage. Because it's very clear that, interestingly, although so often if you ask the wrong questions, the process of constitutional change is something that most voters would find pretty dry and academic. Nonetheless, when it comes down to specific issues, we'll take, for example, the current one on Scottish independence, there is enormous public engagement, but there isn't yet, as we could identify, any way which one could really properly say this is a good way of testing the waters of public opinion. It was something I invited members of the House of Lords to contribute to in the debate we had on our report, admitting, as it were, that we hadn't come up with a solution, although there were, for example, some identifiable experiences, say, in British Columbia in Canada, where they'd done a rather interesting exercise on the process of electoral change, which could have been read across to the whole discussion about the alternative vote. But we couldn't find anything which we felt in our evidence was something we sought to recommend. Various members of the House came up with various ideas, but they are still only ideas, and I don't think they are particularly ones that I would necessarily flag up for discussion this morning. You were right to describe, as I described, the government's response to this report, as it were, I thought, relatively modest, and yet trying to get some system into a way of dealing with a very essential part of our political process as disappointing. I thought Peter Hennessy, Lord Hennessy as he now is, who was a speaker in our debate, put it better. He described the government's response as weary and dreary. And I felt that that was probably quite right. It would seem to have been something which had not been particularly thought about, was not especially constructive or engaged even in its findings. And although initially we thought this might have been just the end of a long period of consideration which had produced the written report, it was the same in the debate which we had. Every single speaker, I think, in that debate, which was well attended except for one, was in favour, broadly, of what the Constitution Committee had recommended and critical of the government response, but it didn't stimulate any more vigorous reply by the minister concerned. I think that it's interesting that the whole area of the way of doing business in legislation is becoming even more relevant and more spoken about, particularly in the House of Lords. And I was interested that just this week, 2 days ago, I had a circular from the House of Lords Working Practices Committee, which has been rather disappointed by the way in which the House has put into operation its findings, which are now some time ago. And one of the things which they said was, and wanted to return to, was the committee would advise the House before second reading if a government bill met good standards of preparation, i.e. we would set up a legislative standards committee, and had clearly set out its policy intentions and consulted fully, and had defined the outcomes desired and how they would be achieved. It would not consider the policy or the bill's drafting. The Merits Committee fulfills this role of technical legislation, but the point being that the establishment of a legislative standards committee within the House of Lords would in fact meet quite a few of the proposals which we made, the Constitution Committee made, about specific constitutional legislation. So if I could just summarise, I think our 3 points were we needed a much more formal and identifiable process for constitutional legislation, that it was perfectly possible, albeit not perhaps in a kind of completely foolproof and watertight way, to define what were meant by constitutional legislation, the matters which would be subject to special attention, and that as a modest contribution to making ministers more aware and more responsible for their particular concerns, there should be the attachment of this ministerial statement on the constitutional process of pre-legislative scrutiny, of proper cabinet committee structure, and of course of some sort of public engagement before the bill was presented.